Good morning. I'm Terry Ettinger. I manage our greenhouses here at the College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York. And this is a house plant care episode of our Sustainability Champions effort here. So one of the first things I want to do is encourage you as we spend the next hour together, if you have questions about caring for your houseplants. In fact, a number of our crew members have already been asking about caring for the houseplants. Make sure you use the chat function to send your questions in, and then I think Sue will be passing those questions on to me. And don't wait. Make sure you get those questions started right now. And what I'm going to do is sort of outline some of the main things that you need to keep in mind about caring for those houseplants. But before we get to that, I just want to spend just a moment or two telling you just a little bit about the greenhouses here at the college, in case maybe you haven't been to the campus before. We are about 64 feet up in the air on the roof of Illick Hall, which is right across the street from the Carrier Dome at Syracuse University. One of the things I want to keep in mind, or help you keep in mind, is that the College of Environmental Science and Forestry is a State University of New York campus. We are not Syracuse University. We are a standalone institution that's part of the SUNY system. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start walking through some of the things that you want to keep in mind to keep your houseplants doing their best throughout the winter months, particularly if you're in the northern part of the United States, where it gets pretty cold and it may be pretty cloudy like it is here in Syracuse today. So let's go ahead and get started by talking about light. One of the things to keep in mind about all houseplants is that they have evolved mostly relatively close to the equator, at least in subtropical regions. And for example, the first images that I want to share with you when it comes to light are taking a look at snowbirds that have flocked to Florida during the winter months. Now, in the Florida, for example, and other locations, days are longer and much, much sunnier. One of the things to keep in mind, therefore, is that because light is so critical to driving the process of photosynthesis, you want to make sure to put your plants in a location where they're going to get as much light as possible. And what you can do to measure the amount of light that is helpful is simply take your hand and set it in front of a window. And if you can see your shadow of the hand, then that is going to be enough light. It's not going to drive a lot of growth during the winter months, but it will at least help the plants to survive. So that's the amount of light we're looking at. If you can provide more light, that's even better. And one of the questions that I often get, well, I use fluorescent lights, artificial lights, something like that. Is that enough light? And the reality of it is it doesn't hurt, but it's no replacement for sunlight. So you can go ahead and use the artificial light, but you can't really rely on it to really drive sufficient photosynthesis during the winter months. So we want to keep light in mind. The next thing we're going to talk a little bit about is temperature. And one of the things, again, that we need to keep in mind is temperature where our houseplants have evolved generally ranges between roughly 40 and 100. And it's very important to keep in mind, particularly those night temperatures. So if we go south into Florida, one of the things to keep in mind, we think it is always warm there, but in reality, it's not unusual. For example, in Naples, where we're taking a look at right now, this is the Naples Botanical Garden. If you take a look, there's a lot of white coverings covering up a lot of the plants there. I was there back in, I think it was 2009-ish, and it was there was frost warnings out in Naples, and that's why those coverings are there, is to keep those tender plants from getting damaged by frost. And it's not unusual in even South Florida during the winter months for temperatures at night to drop down into the low to mid 40s. The average lows in South Florida are around 55 or so. So when it comes to temperature in your own home, taking care of your houseplants in an ideal world at night, you want to drop the temperatures down to around 55 degrees or so. maybe even a little bit cooler. And then during the day, you can let temperatures go up to 70 or 75. One of the worst things you can do is set your thermostat and leave it at 70 to 75 at night. What that ends up doing is making plants continue to try to grow, to respire, to use up photosynthase, and they can literally grow themselves to death. So cooling your plants off at night is something that you can do that is really very, very beneficial. In fact, in our tropical greenhouses here at the college at night, we drop the temperatures down to about 50 to 55 or so, from about 6 o'clock in the evening until about 7 o'clock in the morning, and then we raise the temperatures up to about 75 to 80, which they would maintain on a day like this. But if the sun was out, temperatures would easily go up into the 90s, even with the vents open. So that fluctuating temperature is very, very important. So we've talked a little bit about light. We've talked a little bit about temperature. The next thing we're going to talk about are what do you grow your plants in? And so what I want to spend just a couple of minutes doing is talking about different types of containers. And you really basically have two choices, either plastic or clay. Now, in an ideal world, and I talk about ideal a lot, you can tell, is that I would recommend using clay containers. And the reason for that is because they're porous. And during the winter months, it makes it more difficult to overwater plants when they're grown in clay containers. The other thing to keep in mind is with this small plastic container in front, you can see very often there's a saucer that is added to the container itself. These saucers kill a lot of plants. And the reason for that is once you have watered the plant, the water collects in the saucer and then just sits there. You forget to drain it. It's very important to drain the water out because very often you'll end up having more water that will continue to drain out of that container. When you use clay, that tends not to happen as frequently. So if the opportunity presents itself, make sure that when you get the opportunity, and generally when to transplant is in late winter and early spring, try to transplant into clay containers. And I think over time you're going to find that you're going to have a lot more success. Now, before we go on any further, actually what we'll do next is let's talk about potting soil just a little bit. And I've just been told that to remind you that if you have questions, if anything I'm talking about doesn't seem to be clear, or if you have questions about your specific plants, make sure you use the chat function, and I'll be happy to try to answer your questions as best as I can during the remainder of the program. So again, check the chat out and go ahead and use that function. Now, before we go on and talk a little bit more about watering specifically, again, I just mentioned that clay works a lot better because it's more difficult to overwater plants. Let's talk a little bit about potting soil. And what I've set up here is a little bit of an illustration as far as what a typical potting soil might look like. And I've got a bag of potting mix here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what to avoid in just a moment. But with a typical highly recommended potting soil, it starts with unmilled sphagnum moss peat. It is then ground down into a much finer material that is combined with perlite and vermiculite, and this is what you end up with. You can see the perlite in there. There's little pieces of vermiculite in here, but what you're looking for in a potting mix is something that is roughly between 75 and 85% sphagnum moss peat. And the reason for that is that it holds water very well without becoming overly saturated. One of the things that you want to avoid are potting mixes, and I'm not picking on Miracle-Gro specifically here, but potting mixes where the first ingredient is called forest products, which in fact is what the main ingredient in this bag is. And what forest products is it can be almost anything. It can be ground wood, it can be different types of peats that are not sphagnum moss peat. And what ends up happening is it doesn't drain as well, it breaks down more quickly, and that becomes very problematic. In fact, I think, Christopher, if I'm not mistaken, what we can do is roll real quickly a shot of typical potting soil that we use here in the greenhouses. And then what happens over time with these potting mixes is they will, in fact, break down. And here, what we're taking a look at is the potting mix that has started to break down after a couple of years. And you can see I'm squeezing it, and you can see how it holds together. That's an indication it's too wet and it's so broken down that it does not drain well, and there's not sufficient oxygen in the potting soil for the roots to really grow well. So you need to keep in mind that typically you're going to want to repot your house plants every 2 to 3 years, because the potting soil will break down and or your plants will become pot bound as well. So we talked, okay, actually go ahead and we'll show the other mix as well. I think yeah, there we go. That again is just showing a pile of potting soil that we've mixed up. And here in the greenhouses, one of the things that we do is we add compost that is created by the Onondaga County Resource Recovery Agency. And that compost is extremely inexpensive, and it allows us to sort of bulk up our potting mixes so that they're more sustainable. If we use only straight sphagnum moss peat potting mixes, they come from sphagnum moss bogs, which are not, or they're only gradually renewable. So we're taking material that is part of our waste stream, adding it to our potting mixes to extend their life much, much longer. And the compost that's available in our very large containers for our very large plants, the plants actually do very well in that. Unfortunately, that material is just too coarse for use in a typical houseplant kind of setting. So we've talked about containers, we've talked about light, we've talked about temperature, we've talked about potting soil. The next thing I want to talk a little bit about is watering. And this becomes very, very tricky. And probably overwatering kills more houseplants than just about anything else. And the first thing I want to show you is when potting mixes get too dry, what can end up happening. And then Christopher, if we can maybe roll that piece here momentarily. So what I have done here is this is a container that has a plant growing in it, and the potting soil has gotten a little bit dry, and you can see right around the edges how it's sort of shrunk. And now I'm going to add a little bit of water. And it appears, that it's pretty well watered. You can see water coming out of the drain holes there in the bottom. Then I took this plant out of the container. I sliced the root ball in half. And what you can see is that because that potting soil had become too dry, instead of the water actually saturating the root zone, it came around the edges of the pot itself, drained out the bottom, and right in the center where the roots are, it's almost bone dry. So that can be problematic and becomes problematic during the summer months where maybe you're not watering quite enough. Now, during the winter months, because light levels are very low, temperatures are down at night if you have the opportunity or the ability to cool your home or where the rooms where your plants are off, their plants are not going to use nearly as much water. So what I would suggest doing, and what we do here in our greenhouses, in fact, one of my work study students will be here shortly to start working today, is that for the most part, if we think it's time to water plants, we'll actually wait another day or two before we go in and water. And when it's very cloudy like this, when it's very cold, there's not a big demand for water on the plants. So typically they're going to do quite well, even if they're a little bit underwatered, and particularly with things like, for example, this Glotophyllum, which is a succulent from South Africa, and all succulents and all cacti, if you have them, in our cactus and succulent collection, we only water maybe once a month. So with your succulents and with your cacti, because light is very low, because temperatures are very cool, you really shouldn't need to water maybe more than once a month, maybe even every month and a half or so. And I often recall my grandmother had several aloe plants that she had on a windowsill in one of the rooms in their farmhouse. And she probably didn't water more than maybe once every couple of months during the winter months. So particularly with your succulents, with your cacti, you really want to hold off on the water. And even with those plants that are native to more, to wetter regions of the tropics, for example, again, watering maybe once every week, maybe once every 10 days, depending upon the temperature conditions, is probably all that you're really going to need to do. And if you combine that with a clay pot, it becomes much more difficult to water too much during the winter months. In fact, one of our crew, Audra, was just talking about her aloe. She transplanted it, and she was a little bit surprised to learn when I said maybe only watering once a month or so is all you really need to do. So we've talked a little bit about light, temperature, containers, water. What else? Oh, sure. I am told we have a question about light. Okay, radiator heat and light, is that it? In an apartment. So radiator heat. So actually this brings up a good point. Different heat sources in homes, in apartments during the winter months. Most homes, most apartments have forced air heat. Radiator heat, basically, not the same thing, but it results in the same condition in homes. When heat is on, that results in humidity levels dropping significantly. And that can put a lot of stress on plants, not necessarily because the soil dries out quickly, but just because the air around the foliage dries out quickly. One of the things, and this is something you would have seen on practically any horticulture-related television program or read in a book, anything that you can do to raise humidity levels, and one of the classics is just to simply, for example, if this wasn't filled with potting soil, you could fill it with gravel, just pea gravel, and you can get that at a aquarium store, for example, and then you add water, and then you set your plants on top of it, and then as that water evaporates, it raises humidity levels right around the foliage, and that can work very, very well. Another thing that you can do every occasionally to sort of condition the foliage to those lower humidity levels, or at least relieve those conditions for a short period of time, if it's practical, is set your smaller plants in a kitchen sink and give them a good thorough rinse with the spritzer attachment. I think that's a technical term, by the way, spritzer. Or with some of your bigger plants, if you can maneuver them and actually put them into your shower or your tub, and this can be very effective. A lot of our students will be leaving campus, for example. What you can do is put your plants in the shower, in the tub, give them a good, thorough shower, and that accomplishes a couple of things. It will wash a lot of potential insect pests, which we're going to talk about in just a second, off, and it will also potentially rinse a lot of fertilizer salts out of the potting soil as well. Now, again, going back to the other part of that question about light in an apartment, you can always add artificial light, but as I said before, you don't want to rely on it because it may look very, very bright, but it is no replacement for sunlight. So I'm not saying don't do it, but just don't expect it to necessarily work miracles for you. What you can do is, again, try to move plants into a spot where next to a window they're going to get as much light as possible. Coming back to the lights for just a second, one of the things I would not recommend spending a fortune on lights. And you can find all sorts of different grow lights, and or you can spend hundreds of dollars on these fixtures, let's say in hydroponic magazines or hydroponic stores. The only additional light I've ever used are just inexpensive, 4-foot long fluorescent shop light bulbs that you can get at a big box store or your local hardware store. And that provides enough light to drive just enough photosynthesis to help your plants get through the winter months. It's just simply very, very difficult to have your plants looking great year-round here in upstate New York, for example. In fact, here in our greenhouses, it's unfortunate, right about graduation weekend typically is when our plants tend to look the worst, because they're tropical, they're just coming out of the winter months, they've dropped a lot of their leaves, they haven't been photosynthesizing really at a high rate, and it's not until we get towards coming back in the fall semester that those plants have really recovered. So again, when it comes to light, my recommendation is don't spend a lot of money, just typical fluorescent light bulbs, or inexpensive LEDs, same thing, can help, but you're not gonna work magic with those. Now that we've gone back and taken a look at some of those topics again, I do want to remind you before we go any further that if you do have questions, want some clarification, make sure you use that chat function. We've got people that are waiting here to talk in my ear to let you know, or to let me know that what your questions are. And as we wait for those questions to come in, the next thing I want to talk a little bit about is, in fact, fertilizer. And I'll go ahead and bring this up. A typical box of fertilizer, doesn't matter what the brand is. A lot of times we think about fertilizer as a magic bullet, as a miracle cure, sort of like Miracle Grow. One of the things, and Amanda is out there somewhere. Amanda took my plant propagation class last spring semester, and I probably have raised this before, but if you take a look on this box of fertilizer, one of the things it says in big letters is plant food. Talk about false advertising. Fertilizer is not plant food. There we go. That will help a little bit. Now, I'm going to just pause for a second, let you think a little bit about that. Fertilizer is not plant food. Plants make their own food, and that food is simple sugars, which are then combined into more complex carbohydrates through the process of photosynthesis. So it is impossible. Ross, what do you got here for me? Grow lights too. Will LED light too? Oh, okay. Thank you. It's always nice to have an assistant. Just in from the newsroom, right? Exactly. I'll get back to the LED light tubes in just a moment. But I want to sort of finish up this discussion about fertilizer first. Fertilizer is not plant food. It is humanly impossible to feed plants. They make their own food through the process of photosynthesis. And so what I want to leave with you in caring for your houseplants during the winter months, because light levels are so low and they're not photosynthesizing at a high rate, they're not making a lot of food, you certainly don't want to force them to grow faster by adding fertilizer. And what fertilizer really is more like a supplement, sort of a diet supplement. If they're growing in soil that is deficient in the primary elements, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, that is where fertilizer can come in and be useful, but only during the active growing months. During the winter months here, from roughly October through March into early April, we do not fertilize anything in our greenhouses. Because we don't want the plants to start trying to grow faster than the amount of light that is available to drive that growth. So in addition to overwatering, fertilizing anywhere here in upstate New York, for example, from October through March is not something that I would recommend. Then from mid to late April through, let's say, late August, early September, maybe once every couple of weeks with a half-strength solution of houseplant fertilizer would be plenty. Again, just like with anything else, if it says, and I don't even know what their recommendation on this is, but if it says 1 tablespoon per gallon, it doesn't mean 5 tablespoons is going to be 5 times better. So stick with the label recommendation, and if anything, cut it in half or even in quarters. You really don't need a lot of additional fertilizer with most houseplants. And again, with cacti and succulents, maybe once during the summer months is all you need, because they do very well with relatively small amounts of additional nutrients. A couple of things also to keep in mind. We've got a couple of questions that have come in now. I want to talk about organic fertilizers versus, let's say, again, the synthetic fertilizer like this Miracle Grow. And I also want to talk about will LED light tubes produce better light? So first, organic fertilizer versus a synthetic fertilizer. It's all the same stuff. The nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, the other essential elements. It doesn't matter if it's organic, if it comes out of the back of a cow, for example, or that it's composted municipal sewage sludge, or synthetic fertilizer. The elements are all the same. So the chemistry doesn't matter. In fact, with organic fertilizers, the one thing to keep in mind is that the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in them is much lower, so you need more of that fertilizer to accomplish the same objective. The other thing, as far as fertilizers go, I talked a lot about nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but there are actually 15 or 16 essential elements, depending upon the expert that you talk to. Most of those are what are referred to as trace elements, things like nickel and cadmium and manganese. And those items, those nutrients, those elements are available, not so much in the synthetic fertilizers, but they do tend to be available in those organic fertilizers because it's impossible to strip that out. Now, how important are they in most houseplants? Not something to worry about, because you're going to find those trace elements even in a bag of sphagnum moss-based potting soil. So you don't really need to worry about adding additional trace elements so much to that. And the quantities required are so minute, it's almost impossible to add those in a typical home setting. Now, as far as the LED light tubes go, as compared to fluorescent lights, LED technology, when it comes to growing plants, has come a long way in the last 10 years, and it is rapidly advancing. However, the technology is still such where those LED lights can be designed to grow a very specific crop very, very well. Let's say, for example, a warehouse setting where they're growing lettuce or spinach or basil or cannabis. Those LED lights can be designed to produce a very specific type of light, whereas that can't be accomplished with fluorescent technology. The problem is LEDs are still struggling to provide a very broad spectrum of usable photosynthetically active radiation. And while they can reproduce basically what fluorescent lights can do, and they last a lot longer, as far as them actually being better at driving houseplant growth than fluorescent lights, it really is not that much different at this point in time. And that's in fact one of the things that we've talked about in some of our research compartments. Does it make sense to transition to LED lighting, which would be very expensive to do, but the energy savings would be very high. But again, they don't provide the kind of broad spectrum light that many of our researchers may need at this point in time. So again, if it was me, I would not personally be spending the extra money on LED lights at this point in time, simply because there's just not that much of advantage over the inexpensive fluorescent lights to this point. And again, thank you for that question. What I want to do is remind you again that we do have the chat function, so if you do have questions, make sure you send them this way, and Christopher or Sue, someone out there, will go ahead and get those to me, and I'll do my best to address those. All right, we've talked about light, temperature, containers, water, fertilizer. The next thing that we want to talk a little bit about are all of the different potential pest problems. And here in our greenhouses, I've actually managed our greenhouses since 2008. And I'm pretty proud to say since 2008, so we're talking 12 years, almost 13 years now, we have not used any pesticides in our greenhouses to maintain our teaching collection. It doesn't mean that we haven't dealt with some pest issues, but we've been able to make sure that those pest issues remain at a manageable level. And I'll share with you the pests that we tend to have the most problem with. And Christopher's rolling right now. This is probably our primary pest. It's called mealy bugs, and this particular species is called long-tail mealy bugs. The other mealy bug that we've struggled with are citrus mealy bugs, and I'll tell you a little bit more about those in just a moment or two. This is getting a little bit shaky, so we're going to go to our next shot of our next big pest here in just a moment once that rolls through. This is aphids, and many people deal with aphids. And if you take a look right in the center there, you can see these are melon aphids, those small green aphids. And those, interestingly, those sort of brownish, tannish bumps are what are called mummies. A parasitic wasp, APHIDS, has laid an egg into those live aphids. The egg hatches, it grows into a new parasitic wasp, and then cuts its way out of those dead aphid mummies. And it's been very effective at managing our aphid populations. And then we have one more pest, Christopher, not. Okay, we're going to get to that in just a second. So we talked about the mealybugs, which I'll spend a little bit more time talking about. We talked about our aphids, and then the other one that we do occasionally struggle with are spider mites. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to pull that up, but I'll spend a little bit more time talking about all three of those. First off, we'll talk about the mealybugs first. Not often in a home setting do I see mealybugs as being a big issue. Here in our greenhouses, we have managed to completely eliminate the citrus mealybug by using what is called the citrus mealybug destroyer beetle. It is actually a lady beetle that is native to Australia, that was used here in the United States, out in California, as the first biological control agent for any kind of a pest in citrus orchards back in the late 1800s. When I first started here, we had quite a few citrus mealybugs. We brought in some of those mealybug destroyer beetles. The immature stage looks like a little alligator, just like any other lady beetle, and it completely cleaned up our infestation of citrus mealybugs. Unfortunately, with long-tail mealybugs, there are no really effective predatory insects at this point in time, and even insecticides don't work particularly well. So the way we manage those for the most part is, as we see those populations start to build up, we keep wiping them down. We'll spray them off with a strong stream of water from a power washer, and it doesn't eliminate the infestation, but it keeps the infestation at a low enough level that it doesn't affect the health of our plants. When it comes to aphids, again, the parasitic wasps that have become established in the greenhouse tend to keep those under control once the populations of aphids have gotten high enough. The other thing we'll do, and that you can do at home if that becomes a problem, is you can just set those smaller plants, if you see aphids, underneath or in your sink or in the shower, and again, just wash them down. Washing them down to knock the population down. You're not going to get rid of the pests, but you can keep them at a level where they're not going to damage your plants. And I would certainly never use an insecticide of any kind inside of my home. So relying on simply removing them and or washing them off is what I would recommend. The third pest that we do struggle with are, again, spider mites, which are very, very tiny. And I do have a couple plants over there that have a few spider mites on them right now, but they're so tiny, it'd be very difficult for us to be able to get them in a spot where you could actually see them. Again, spider mites are problematic under very low humidity conditions and can become problematic during the winter months. Let's see. Okay, Ross. Well, let's see if we can get it. It's in the foam cooler there. He is so good. Thanks. Yeah, I don't know if we're going to be able to do this or not, Christopher. But so these are rooted cuttings, and is this going to be the angle, the camera that's going to work best for you? Now, if I'm going to right here at my fingertip. I'm going to see if you can go ahead and zoom in there. And, no, whoops, I don't know if you, are you able to get that? I can't see the monitor right now, but what you're theoretically looking at are these very, very tiny, not even the size of a pinhead, not the thumb, it's actually at the end of my finger here. And my middle finger here on my left hand. So follow that down. I'll just leave that there. And you can see a couple of things. There's a little bit of webbing. And you can see how the leaves of this miniature rose are very, very stippled, meaning that there's these little tiny dots all over. That's where the spider mites, yeah, I don't know if, again, I can't see the monitor, but I can actually see those spider mites crawling around on that webbing a little bit. Excellent, good. So what we can do is, again, just take a strong stream of water. I'm going to pull these rooted stem cuttings out of here. And I'm just going to set that over there and knock that population back. Ross, thank you again for your assistance there. And that does a very good job of keeping the population down to preventing any significant damage other than some of that stippling from occurring during the winter months. And again, when spider mites are going to be most problematic is during the middle of the winter when our forced air heat, our radiator heat is drying the atmosphere out a lot. Spider mites tend not to be a problem during the summer because rainfall washes those off pretty regularly. And in fact, that's another thing that we do here in the greenhouses at the college is during the summer months, many of the plants in both our tropical teaching collection and our dendrology collection, we move out onto the roof right behind me. And the reason for that is, first off, it can go up to 115, 120 degrees here in the greenhouses during the summer. Very, very warm. It also allows us to be able to give the greenhouses good thorough cleaning, and when we move the plants outside, a lot of the naturally occurring beneficial insects can address our infestations of mealy bugs and spider mites and so forth. And the other nice thing about having the plants out on the roof, nature tends to do a pretty good job of keeping them watered for us a lot of times as well. So it reduces the amount of time that we need to spend watering. So does that mean maybe moving your house plants outside during the summer? A lot of it sort of depends on the kinds of conditions that you might have available. The first thing you need to be able to do is if you choose to move your house plants outside, you need to have them in a spot that's relatively close to a convenient source of water. If you move them outside and it takes a lot of effort for you to be able to get water to them, you're going to tend possibly not to water them enough. One of the nice things about our roof right outside of the greenhouse is we have several hose bibs, so we can set up water hoses and be able to water those plants outside very, very easily if nature doesn't take care of that for us. So a source of water is very important. Another thing to keep in mind are the potential for animals. It's amazing, but in our neighborhood, we live only about 10 blocks from campus. deer are everywhere, and it can be very difficult to keep plants outside because deer will feed on them, as well as woodchucks and raccoons. It's amazing at all the different critters we have. So if you're going to move your house plants outside, you want to make sure that there aren't urban wildlife that are going to enjoy a good meal. Another thing to keep in mind if you're going to move your plants outside is you are going to tend to want to have them in a spot where they get really good, strong morning light through, let's say, early afternoon, and then maybe a little bit of dappled light during the heat of the afternoon. And that's certainly one of the things that we do not get out here on the roof. And some of our plants do suffer a little bit. Foliage can tend to get a little bit scorched. It can tend to get a little bit pale. And what we find is the benefit of having the plants outside outweighs, particularly during the winter months, because they have photosynthesized at such a high rate. They tend to look better longer inside, even though they may suffer a little bit from the extra reflected light off of the glass of the greenhouses. So those are a couple of things to keep in mind should you choose to move the plants outside. Now we've got just a couple of minutes left, and I want to remind you again, we've had some really good questions. The chat function is still available, and so if you have questions about whether it's what types of containers to use or how to care for your plants if you're going away for the winter break, and how to take care of them, maybe even a little bit about propagation. In fact, why don't I go ahead and talk about that for just a moment or two and do a little bit of shameless self-promotion. Now, I might be a little bit biased, but I'm of the opinion that probably plant propagation is the best class here at the College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Just saying. You know, Amanda, I can't see her out there, but I'm sure Amanda would agree. She took plant propagation last spring, and I teach plant propagation during the coming spring semester. So if you're seeing this and thinking about what classes to take, I would encourage you to think about this as we're just wrapping up advising her over the next couple of weeks or so, and registration then starts. But when it comes to a simple propagation system, one of the things I would suggest considering is an inexpensive styrofoam cooler. I think this cost $5 or $6. Ross, you're coming back again? Maybe, do you want to just co-host or? Thanks. Oh man, holy cow. How much time do we have left? This is like 3 or 4 hours worth of questions here. I'm not hearing in the ear here, unfortunately. Anyway, let's talk about the cooler as a propagation chamber. Again, about $5 or $6 at a grocery store. I have filled it with a sphagnum moss-based potting mix. And I use this to propagate some miniature roses, some big leaf hydrangeas, some Russian sage, and some lavender. And I took those cuttings, 15, okay, thanks, Ross. I took those cuttings back in, let's say, I think it was mid to late July, early August. It's now just before Thanksgiving. I put the cuttings in here and then just set this entire styrofoam cooler inside of a large plastic bag. In fact, I think it was a dry cleaning bag. What that basically did was create a miniature greenhouse. And I don't know if you're going to be able to see that, but there are holes in the bottom here to encourage good drainage as well. Just cover it over. It creates a miniature greenhouse. And these cuttings all rooted within about 4 to 6 weeks. So with many of your house plants, you could use a very similar setup to go ahead and propagate stem cuttings or leaf cuttings. In the plant propagation class, for example, we propagate begonias by leaf cuttings. African violets are also easy to propagate by leaf cuttings. And many other houseplants are easy to propagate by stem cuttings. So that's one of the things, and one of the things that we'll talk about in the plant propagation class is how to set up different types of inexpensive propagation systems. And maybe another session we might have Sue, keep this in mind, is possibly a session for the Sustainability Champion Series on propagation this coming spring, and maybe get some of my students involved as well. So, quick thing about propagation there. Before we go back to the questions, one other plant that I often get a lot of questions about are holiday cacti. And a lot of people refer to them as Christmas cactus. There's actually 3 different species of these epiphytic cacti. They are, in fact, true cacti. They're native to woodlands in southeastern Brazil, and they grow in trees. They don't grow in the ground. And one of the things to keep in mind is they've been so highly hybridized over the last 150 years or so, it's very difficult to simply refer to them as Thanksgiving cacti or Christmas cacti or Easter cacti. As a broad generalization, the types of these epiphytic cacti that are primarily Thanksgiving cacti, they will have sharp sort of leaf margins, whereas Christmas cacti will have more rounded type of margins. But as far as their care goes, it really doesn't matter at all. These plants, because they are epiphytic, growing in trees, they prefer a very bright but dappled shade. So you can hang them in the shade of a tree during the summer months, bring them into a cool room, and that's what triggers their flower buds typically to form, is a response to increasing night length in combination with cool temperatures. So if you were to have a room where temperatures went down to around 50 degrees at night, you're always going to get a really good amount of flower production. If your room tends to be around 70 or 75, you're going to find you tend to have many fewer flowers. But you're going to tend to get that first flush of flowers right around Halloween or the first to second week in November. The other nice thing about this plant is that it's very easy to propagate from stem segments. In fact, I'll go ahead and sacrifice this one here. And if you just take this stem segment and you set it into soil, it will root in a couple of weeks. And many people have heirloom holiday cacti that their great-grandmother or great-grandfather grew, and it's now 50 or 60 or 70 years old. You can start new ones by something as easy or as small as this. The other thing to keep in mind is that you can have very old plants in very small containers as long as you keep them well watered during the summer months. And they, in fact, can go quite dry. And if it gets so big that you need to move it, you can simply cut it back or just pinch it back to almost just stubs, maybe only 3 or 4 inches high, move it into a bigger container, and it will do just fine. You don't need to do anything real dramatic or try to repot it completely intact. So just a quick note about the holiday cacti. Now, let's see. Adjust my glasses here. Do you recommend treating tap water for chlorine and so forth? We don't. Our hoses are hooked directly up to a domestic water supply, so it's a City of Syracuse water supply. We don't allow the chlorine to evaporate. Whatever comes out of the hose is what we water with. Our biggest struggle here in Syracuse is that our domestic water supply tends to have a relatively high pH. It's fairly hard water. And if we were a production greenhouse setting where we were growing crops of bedding plants for sale in the spring, we would want to inject an acid into that water to lower the pH. In fact, any production greenhouse here in upstate New York that the plant propagation class visits, for example, they do inject acid into the water to drop the pH. What we find is that the water pH for the plants that we're growing, it doesn't really significantly impact them to the point that I'm that concerned about. So that's a very long answer. The short answer is It's really not necessary, in my experience. Let's see, are there certain houseplants that are cold tolerant and could survive in an unheated, screened-in porch? I would be very hesitant, I guess, to do that because, you know, if it goes to, let's say, much below 25 or so for more than an hour or two, that can cause some real problems. And so it's hard to say, you know, how cold an unheated porch might get. I know a lot of people that I've talked to over the years have had Chinese hibiscus, they've had Norfolk Island pine, they've had a lot of different plants that they've sort of tried to keep out, and it hasn't ended up working out well for them. So an unheated situation is just something I really would not suggest trying with any of the houseplants. And a quick story there is many years ago, I moved from Southern Illinois when I finished my master's degree to St. Paul, Minnesota, where I worked on a PhD at the University of Minnesota, and made that move right after Christmas in 1983. We got there, got a bunch of stuff moved in that first night. There were still a few plants in the back seat or in the back of the U-Haul. It went down to about 25 below that night. And the next morning, I remembered those plants, went out to get them. They literally shattered. They were thoroughly frozen, and they basically, it's like they freeze dried. Yeah, 25 below with, there were some African violets. I think there was a citrus tree, a couple of other plants. They did not like that cold temperature. Let's see. Will acid-loving plants tolerate city? Well, we just talked about that, when inside for the winter. Again, in my experience, our plants have not suffered significantly from being watered with City of Syracuse water, which comes directly out of Skaneateles Lake. Oh, here's a good thing. When to prune houseplants, when to transplant houseplants. The time to do all of that active work, and in fact, we do that here in the greenhouses as well, is late winter, early spring, particularly with transplanting. You don't want to be transplanting in the fall, disturbing the roots, disturbing the branch structure, removing branches when light levels are so low. By doing all the transplant work, let's say from mid-March into April and into May, those plants are going to have the entire growing season to recover from any disturbance that does occur. When these greenhouses were rebuilt between 2012 and 2014, we repotted all 2,000 or so plants in our collection. And we did all of that work before moving back into this greenhouse between April of 2014 and September of 2014. No plants came back into the new greenhouses until they had been transplanted, until they've been moved into larger pots, until any root-bound plants had their roots disturbed in such a way to reduce that problem with any bound roots at all. A lot of plants we had to sort of cut the roots back a little bit to fit them into large containers. So again, all of that work was done during the growing season, not over the winter months. Now, as far as pruning goes, basically the same thing. You don't want to do any pruning between October and February. If you're going to be removing branches, you're going to end up removing essentially solar panels. And you want to keep all of those branches, you want to keep all of those leaves intact and capturing as much sunlight as possible throughout the winter months. Another news release just in. Let's see. What do you do when you get root rot? And I'm assuming this is plants. This is not like Keith getting root rot. Yeah, Keith, that'd be problematic for you. Anyway, as far as pruning goes, the time to do that would be, again, in the spring, in the summer months, when new leaves would emerge and allow photosynthesis to occur. As far as root rot The other question that came in, this must have been from Christopher, but anyway, when it comes to root rot, this is something Audra was struggling with again in her, with her aloe plant, is the best thing that you can do to avoid any problems with root systems is to make sure that you cut back on the watering that you're doing. What ends up killing more houseplants than anything else is too much water. And how that happens often is that when plants get overwatered, the roots start to suffocate. They shut down, they take water, they stop taking water up. And what ends up happening, even though that plant may be sitting in a saucer full of water, the leaves will start to wilt. And so you think, oh, I just watered the other day, but the plant's wilting, so I better add more water. And then it wilts more. And then you add more water, and before you know it, the plant has suffocated. And as I was saying previously, a little bit earlier in the program, here in our greenhouses during the winter months, we tend, if we think the plants need to be watered today, we'll wait another day or two. The plants are much more tolerant of being underwatered during the cloudy, cool weather of winter than during the summer. So if you think the plants are suffering from root rot, stop watering, let the soil dry out. That will also reduce problems, potentially with fungus gnats, very small black flies that can be problematic with potting soils that are overwatered. And then if the plant doesn't recover, I wouldn't try to do any replanting. In the winter, I'd wait until late March, early April, replant, assess the condition of the plants, and then decide whether or not to keep that plant. But again, less water during the winter is a good idea. Putting plants, when you do repot this coming spring, putting them into a clay container is a good idea. Anything that you can do to reduce the potential for overwatering is really, really important. Last couple of questions. We're running out of time here. Let's see. Growing vegetables. Well, a couple of things to keep in mind. Trying to grow vegetables or even herbs indoors during the winter months is, again, a real struggle because of the very low light levels. You may be able to grow some microgreens, and there's many different types of microgreens that are available now that come prepackaged from seed houses, and they don't need a lot of light. You could set those, a tray underneath of a set of fluorescent lights, and harvest microgreens for salads throughout the winter months, and you could get 3 or 4 cuttings from those before you would have to start more. As a general rule, with vegetables that you're going to plant out into a garden after the chance of frost has passed, you want to count back about 8 weeks before those plants would go out into the garden. So some of our cold crops, our cool season crops like cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, those you would want to put in the garden roughly about mid to late April in most years. So counting back 6 to 8 weeks, we're talking about mid-February to early March when you would sow those. With frost-sensitive plants, things like tomatoes and peppers and eggplants, our melons, for example, all of those you would count back 8 weeks from roughly the 3rd to 4th week in May. So that means you would not seed those until late March or even early April. And then by the time they're ready to go into the garden, they will be a solid 6 to 8, maybe 10 inches tall. You don't want them too big. And then they'll be ready to transplant after the chance of frost has passed. All right, with that, we're just about out of time. I want to thank you all for joining us here this morning for this Houseplant Contair Sustainability Champions Series. I'm Terry Ettinger, and hopefully we'll see you again in the not-too-distant future.